I've worked hospital security for 6 years, almost all of it on overnights. Most of the job is routine. You walk the halls, answer calls from nurses, remove the occasional drunk family member, and make sure the doors that are supposed to stay locked actually stay locked. After a while, you get used to the strange sounds buildings make at night. Elevators settling, air vents groaning, wheels squeaking on empty gurneys. You learn what belongs and what doesn't. That night, I was assigned to the oldest wing of the hospital because part of it was being renovated. 3 floors had already been cleared out, but the 4th floor still had a few occupied rooms on one side, while the far end had been shut down for months. It used to be long-term care before they moved everyone into the new tower. Half the lights back there were turned off to save power. The rooms were empty, the nurses' station was dark, and plastic sheets covered sections of the wall where construction was supposed to begin the following week. A little after 2 a.m., dispatch called me on the radio and said a patient in room 417 kept reporting that someone was standing outside her door. The nurse had already checked twice and found no one there, but the patient was elderly and terrified and refused to calm down. I said I'd head up. When I got off the elevator, the active side of the floor was quiet. Most of the patients were asleep. Monitors beeped softly behind closed doors. At the nurses' station, one of the night nurses looked relieved when she saw me. She told me the patient was lucid, not confused, and had been repeating the same thing for the last 20 minutes. She said the patient claimed a tall man had been standing in the hallway just beyond the light from her room, watching her without moving. I asked if staff had seen anyone. She shook her head. No visitors were allowed at that hour, and the stairwell door on that side was supposed to be alarmed if opened. I went into 417 and spoke to the patient myself. She was awake, sitting upright in bed with both hands clenched around her blanket. She wasn't rambling, she didn't seem confused. She just kept staring at the doorway and saying, "He waits until you leave, then he comes back." I asked her what he looked like. She said, "Not a doctor, not a nurse, too tall, and he stands wrong." That last part stayed with me. I stepped into the hallway and checked both directions. Empty. The active end of the floor was well lit, but 30 yards down, where the old wing began, the hall faded into long stretches of shadow. I started walking that way, shining my flashlight along the baseboards, into open utility closets, and through the narrow windows in the shut-down patient rooms. Nothing. I checked the stairwell door first, still secured, no alarm. Then I continued deeper into the closed wing. It felt different almost immediately. The air was cooler. The smell changed from disinfectant to dust and stale drywall. My flashlight passed over stripped beds, stacked equipment, and old whiteboards still hanging beside empty doors. Some of them still had names written on them from months earlier. Most had been wiped clean, but one still said "Fall Risk" in red marker. Halfway down the hall, I heard a soft sound behind me. Not a voice, not footsteps exactly, more like a rubber sole dragging once across tile. I turned around and snapped my light back down the corridor. At the far end, where the glow from the occupied side barely reached, someone was standing in the hallway. I remember how still he was. He wasn't peeking around a corner or moving toward me. He was just there, tall, thin, dressed in something dark that blended into the shadows. I couldn't make out his face because the light hit his body but seemed to leave his head in darkness. I said, "Hospital security, identify yourself." No response. I started walking toward him, keeping my voice firm, telling him he wasn't allowed in the restricted area. He didn't move until I got about 20 feet away. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, and stepped through the open doorway of one of the empty rooms. I picked up my pace and reached the room within seconds. Empty. No bathroom in that room, no closet large enough to hide in, no second door, just stripped furniture and a covered monitor stand against the wall. The window was sealed shut. There was nowhere for anyone to go. I stood there for a second, sweeping my light across every corner, telling myself I must have misjudged which room he'd entered. Then, behind me, from further down the wing, I heard the same dragging step again. This time, it was followed by a quiet metallic clink. I turned around and back into the hall. At the very end of the corridor was an old medication room with a split door and a narrow wired glass window. It had been locked for months. Now the bottom half of the door was closed, but the top half stood open by maybe an inch, just enough to show darkness inside. As I stared at it, something tapped the glass from the other side, once. I radioed for another guard to come up to 4 North. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Then I walked to the medication room and pushed the top half of the door wider with my flashlight. The room was pitch black, no windows, shelves on both sides, a sink in the back. I hit the wall switch. Nothing happened. My flashlight beam moved across the shelves. On the floor near the sink was a wheelchair. That was wrong, for 2 reasons. First, the room had been emptied during shutdown. Second, the wheelchair wasn't from our hospital. It was old, heavy, and stained yellow with age. I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Not rot exactly, more like mildew and old water trapped in a basement. There was no one in the room. Then my radio crackled. It was the nurse from the station, and her voice was shaky. She said the patient in 417 was screaming again and kept saying, "He's behind you now." I turned so fast, I hit my shoulder on the shelving. The doorway was empty. I backed out of the room and into the hall just as the second guard came through the fire doors from the occupied side. I told him what I'd seen, and he gave me the look people give when they're trying not to make you feel stupid. But he followed me anyway. We checked the room together. Same result. Empty. Then he noticed something near the wheelchair. A hospital wristband. Not current, old style, the kind they stopped using years ago. He bent to read it, then stopped. I asked him what it said. He looked at me and said, "Room 417. We both turned toward the lit end of the hall. A second later, over the radio, the nurse shouted for us to hurry. We ran back. By the time we got there, the patient was sobbing so hard she could barely talk. She pointed at the hallway outside her room and kept saying the man had come closer this time, closer than before. She said he leaned into the doorway and smiled at her. The nurse was pale. She told us that while she was in the room calming the patient, the motion light at the far end of the active hall had switched on by itself, as if someone had walked past. We reviewed the cameras before sunrise. The camera covering the nurse's station showed nothing unusual. The one aimed toward the old wing had interference for a little over 3 minutes. Not full static, just enough distortion to make shapes smear when anything moved near the edge of the frame. But right before the signal cleared, there was one usable image, a tall figure standing outside room 417, not facing the patient, facing the camera. The image wasn't clear enough for a face, but his posture looked wrong somehow, like the patient had said. The shoulders were tilted too far forward, and one arm hung longer than the other. The worst part was what happened next. In the final frame before the distortion cut out, the figure wasn't by the door anymore. He was halfway down the hall toward the camera. No walking sequence, no blur of movement, just closer. Facilities searched the closed wing that morning. They found no sign of forced entry, and the stairwell alarm had never triggered. The medication room was locked again when they got there, though neither of us had locked it. The old wheelchair was gone. The patient in 417 was transferred to another floor that afternoon. She refused to talk about the man again, except for one thing she told the nurse before leaving. She said, "He thought I was someone else." I still work security, but I won't take that wing alone anymore. People laugh when I say that. I let them. Hospitals are full of stories. Most of them have explanations. That one never did.
I was a volunteer firefighter in a rural county for almost 11 years. Most calls were what you'd expect: car wrecks, brush fires, medical assists, electrical problems after storms. The strange thing about working nights in a small area is that you get to know every road, every farmhouse light, every barking dog. So when something feels off, you notice it fast. The call came in just after 3 a.m. during a cold snap in January. Dispatch toned us out for smoke visible from a residence on Old Mercer Road. The caller was a truck driver passing through. He said he saw smoke coming from a 2-story farmhouse set back from the road, but no flames. No one answered when he laid on the horn. He didn't want to get any closer. We rolled with one engine and a tanker because that part of the county had no hydrants. I was riding passenger. The whole drive out there, I kept waiting to see the glow of a working fire through the trees. But there was nothing, just black woods and the engine lights reflecting off frost. When we reached the property, the house came into view at the end of a long gravel drive. The truck driver hadn't been wrong about the smoke. Thin gray smoke was drifting from somewhere near the rear of the house, but it wasn't pouring out the windows the way you'd expect. There were no flames visible, no crackling, no orange flicker through the curtains. What struck me first was how quiet it was. No generator, no dogs, no people outside. The house itself looked occupied. 2 vehicles in the drive, curtains up, front porch shoveled recently. This wasn't an abandoned place. Our captain had us split. 2 guys pulled a line as a precaution. I went with him to make contact. We pounded on the front door and yelled fire department. Nothing. He tried the knob. Unlocked. We stepped into a dark foyer that smelled faintly like wood smoke and something else underneath it. Not rotten, not chemical, just old and sour, like wet fabric left shut in a closet. The heat was off. You could feel the cold inside. We announced ourselves again and moved room to room. The first floor was neat in a way that felt deliberate. Furniture polished, dishes clean, a clock ticking in the dining room so loud it sounded wrong. But there were no people anywhere. The smoke seemed strongest toward the back, so we headed for the kitchen. That's where we found the stove. One burner was on low beneath a blackened pot, and the pot had burned almost dry. Smoke rose from it in thin, lazy strings. It should have been a simple fix. Captain shut off the burner, moved the pot, and called out that we had the source. That should have been the end of it. Then we heard footsteps upstairs. Not creaks settling from our movement, actual footsteps, slow, crossing from one side of the second floor to the other. Captain looked at me. I looked at him. We both heard it. He called up, "Fire department, come down now." The footsteps stopped. We waited. Then a door opened overhead. Captain radioed the crew outside that we had possible occupants still inside and started for the stairs. I followed with my flashlight. The second-floor landing was dark except for moonlight coming through the hall window. There were 4 doors up there. 3 stood open. One at the far end was closed. The open rooms were empty. Beds made, closets empty, no signs anyone had been sleeping there recently. The closed door was different. Old brass knob, scratch marks around the frame. Not damage exactly, more like years of people opening and closing it with rings on their hands. Captain tried the knob. Locked. He knocked hard and identified us again. No answer. Then, from the other side of the door, came a voice. Very quiet, very calm. It said, "You're late." Captain asked who was inside and whether they could unlock the door. No answer. He told me to go get the irons from downstairs. I turned and headed for the stairs. As I reached the landing, I heard the voice again behind me. This time it said, "Don't let him open it." I stopped dead and turned around. Captain was staring at the door. He asked if I had said something. I told him no. He hadn't heard the same words I did. He said all he heard was movement. I got the tools. By the time I came back up, 2 more volunteers had joined us. Captain gave the order, and we forced the door. The room beyond was colder than the rest of the house by at least 10 degrees. My flashlight found wallpaper peeling in strips, an iron dead frame, and a wooden rocking chair near the window. In the chair sat a woman. At least that's what I thought for the first second. Then my light settled properly, and I realized it was a dress hanging over the back of the rocker. The shape had fooled me in the dark. The room was empty. No one under the bed, no closet big enough to hide in, window locked from the inside. One of the guys muttered that somebody must be messing with us. Then Captain noticed something on the floorboards beside the bed. Ash. Not the kind from a cigarette or fireplace. This was finer, darker, spread in a rough circle like something had burned right there on the floor without scorching the wood beneath it. I swept my light upward. Above the bed, hanging on the wall, were 6 framed family photographs. They were old, black and white, maybe early 1900s. Most showed the same farmhouse and the same family standing on the porch over different years. In every single one, there was a tall man standing slightly apart from the others. Same face, same posture, same dark suit. I know how impossible that sounds. People say all old photographs make everyone look alike. Maybe that's true. But this looked like the same man, aging not at all, while the people around him changed. Captain was still focused on the room. He told us to check for extension into the attic. There was a pull cord near the closet. I tugged it, and the attic hatch dropped open with a rush of cold dust. Something moved up there. Fast. All I caught was the sound of weight shifting and one hard impact against wood, like someone scrambling backward on hands and knees. Captain shouted for whoever was up there to come down. Nothing. He sent me up with another guy while he stayed below. The attic was low and cramped, full of insulation and old beams. Our light swept over trunks, broken picture frames, and rolled carpets. The far corners were deep shadow. We crawled toward the back where we heard the noise. That's when my partner found the tunnel. Not a real tunnel, more like a space between the attic wall and the roofline where boards had been removed to create a narrow cavity you couldn't see from below unless you got close. Inside were blankets, food wrappers, empty water jugs, and candles burned down into saucers. Someone had been living up there. I called it out. Captain came up to the hatch beneath us and asked if there was a body or a victim. I leaned back to answer him, and from the cavity, inches from my partner's face, a voice whispered, "Still here." He yelled and jerked backward so hard he nearly crashed through the ceiling. We tore the cavity apart after that. Nobody inside, nowhere for anyone to crawl deeper, no adjoining space, just those supplies, and at the very back, a stack of old photographs wrapped in cloth. All of them were of the house. Some were recent, taken from outside at night, through windows, from the tree line. One showed our station engine parked at a completely different emergency there 2 winters earlier. None of us had ever been told of prior calls to that address. Sheriff's deputies came out before dawn. They searched the property and eventually found the homeowner's truck in the barn, but no homeowner. The registration matched an older man who was supposed to live alone. Neighbors later said they hadn't seen him in weeks, which was strange because they usually saw his porch light every night. The deputies also found a trail of footprints behind the house, leading into the woods, bare footprints, in freezing weather. They followed them for almost a half-mile before they simply stopped in the snow. No return prints, no sign of a vehicle, nothing. As the sun came up, I went back inside one last time with a deputy to collect the photographs from the attic. The second-floor room had already been cleared, but I looked in anyway. The rocking chair was moving, slowly, back and forth. No draft, no open window, no one near it. The deputy saw it too. He didn't say a word. He just reached past me and pulled the door shut. The house was never reoccupied. It was demolished later that year after an investigation I was never given details about. Officially, the call was listed as an unattended cooking incident with suspicious circumstances. I still don't know who spoke to us from that locked room, or who had been living in the attic, or where the homeowner went. But I do know one thing. When the voice behind that door said, "You're late," it sounded less like fear and more like disappointment.
I drove county roads on the midnight shift for 7 years as a deputy. Rural patrol is different from city work. You can go an hour without seeing another car, then get a call that puts you 30 minutes from backup. People imagine it must be peaceful. Sometimes it is. Other times it feels like the whole county is asleep, except for whatever's wrong. This happened in early fall, just after harvest season. The call came in around 1:30 a.m. from a woman who lived alone near the edge of the county line. She said someone was walking circles around her house and knocking on different windows. She was whispering when she called. Dispatch told me she sounded terrified, but kept insisting she hadn't actually seen a face, just a shape passing the curtains. I was the closest unit by a long shot. Her property sat off a gravel road with fields on 3 sides and a patch of woods behind it. The house was small, 1 story, with a detached garage and a tool shed. By the time I turned onto her lane, she had gone quiet on the line, but dispatch said the call was still connected. Her porch light was on. The rest of the property was dark. I parked short of the house with my headlights off and listened before getting out. It was one of those nights where sound travels. I could hear insects in the ditch, the ticking of my engine cooling, and somewhere far off a dog barking. But around her house itself, nothing. I approached on foot with my light low and circled the outside first. Fresh footprints were visible in the dirt beneath the windows, boot prints, deep enough to be recent. They went all the way around the house, just like she'd said. On the backside, I found something else, a kitchen chair sitting in the yard, directly beneath a small bathroom window. I radioed it in and knocked on the front door, identifying myself. The woman opened it immediately, like she'd been standing there waiting. She was in her late 50s, maybe, pale, shaking, and still clutching her phone. She kept looking over my shoulder into the yard. I asked if anyone else was inside. She said no. I asked if she'd heard anything since calling. She said the knocking stopped a minute before I arrived, but then she heard what sounded like breathing outside her bedroom wall. I brought her into the living room where I could keep an eye on the front and asked some questions while I listened to the house. She lived alone. No recent disputes, no ex-boyfriend, no family expected over, just the same repeated tapping moving from one side of the house to the other, like someone trying every window to see which one would scare her most. I asked if she had curtains open anywhere. She said no. Then she hesitated and told me something she hadn't mentioned to dispatch. She said the person outside had knocked on the glass in sets of 3, paused, then done it again, same pattern every time. And once, when she finally got brave enough to look through the kitchen curtain, she saw someone standing so close to the window she could only see a piece of their chest. That told me whoever it was didn't want to be identified. They wanted her afraid. I cleared the house first. Bedroom, bathroom, spare room, utility room, all clear. No forced entry, windows locked. Then I went back outside and checked the detached garage. Also clear. Backup was still at least 20 minutes out, so I told the woman to stay on the couch, keep her phone on, and not move from the living room while I did a wider search around the property. The woods behind the house started about 40 yards from the back fence. Between them was a strip of dead grass, then an old clothesline pole, and a rusted swing set. My flashlight passed over all of it. That's when I saw the scarecrow. It was standing at the edge of the field beyond the fence, just barely inside my light. Old coat, broad hat, arms stretched on a crossbar. Nothing unusual about that in farm country, except the woman later swore it hadn't been there that morning. I kept moving, checking for fresh tracks. The ground was dry enough that I only caught partial prints in softer patches. They seemed to angle from the field toward the house, then back again.
I was halfway to the tree line when dispatch came over the radio and asked me to confirm the resident was safe. I said yes. Dispatch paused, then said, "She's on the phone with 911 again." I stopped walking. I told them she was inside and I had just spoken to her. Dispatch said, "No, deputy. The caller says you're in the yard, but you haven't moved in several minutes." For a second, I didn't understand what that meant. Then every hair on my neck stood up. I turned and looked back at the house. From where I stood, I could see the living room window glowing yellow through the curtains, and in front of that window, between me and the house, was a dark silhouette standing perfectly still. It was shaped like a man, same height as me, same brim hat, same broad shoulders. Only I wasn't standing there. I yelled and ran back toward the house. The figure moved the instant I did, not toward me, but sideways, gliding past the window and around the corner so fast it looked wrong in my flashlight beam. I heard the woman inside scream. By the time I reached the door, it was locked. Not jammed, locked. I pounded on it and shouted for her to open up. She was crying so hard she could barely get the chain off. When I finally got inside, she grabbed my arm and said, "It was looking in at me from the hallway window. I thought it was you, until it smiled." I got her behind me and checked every room again. All clear. But the back hallway window was different now. 3 wet smears ran down the outside of the glass at shoulder height, like someone had pressed dirty fingers there and dragged them slowly downward. I called for emergency backup and kept the woman with me in the center of the house. While we waited, I asked her about the scarecrow in the field. She stared at me and said her husband used to make one every year before he died, but she hadn't put one out since his funeral. Then she said something I didn't like at all. She said the coat on the scarecrow looked exactly like her husband's old work coat. I stayed with her until backup arrived. 2 more units came and we searched the property together. By then, the field was empty. No scarecrow, no post in the ground, no coat, just flattened grass where something had been standing. One of the other deputies found the kitchen chair moved from beneath the bathroom window to the rear bedroom window. None of us had touched it. The fresh boot prints now circled only half the house before stopping near the back fence. Stopping, not turning, as if whoever made them had simply ceased to exist there. We decided to move the woman out for the night. While one deputy escorted her to his cruiser, I did one final pass by the hallway. That's when I noticed the framed family photos on a shelf near the phone. In one picture, taken years earlier in front of the same house, the woman's husband was standing beside her, wearing a canvas work coat and a dark-brimmed hat. The exact silhouette I'd seen outside the window. I asked her how long her husband had been dead. She said, 9 years tomorrow. I didn't tell her what I was thinking. There are some things you don't say to a terrified person in the middle of the night. We took her to her sister's place and filed the report. Officially, it went down as prowler activity with no suspect located. 2 days later, she called the station, asking for me by name. She sounded calmer. She said she had gone back home in daylight and found something hanging from the clothesline in the backyard. It was her husband's coat. Dry, clean, buttoned all the way up. One sleeve had been pinned across the chest as if someone were trying to make it wave. I went out there myself. The coat was real, old enough to match the photo. She swore she'd never taken it out of storage. We searched the house and shed and found no signs anyone had been staying there. She sold the property within 3 months. I still patrol that road sometimes. The house is occupied again now. New owners, fresh paint, kids' toys in the yard. But every fall, around the same week the original call came in, somebody reports seeing a man standing at the edge of the field behind the house just after midnight. By the time deputies arrive, there's never anyone there. Only the impression in the grass where something has been waiting.